Hello everyone, thanks so much for taking the time to check out this video. Today is going to be part one of a project which I'm super excited about, which is going to be the top 10 most influential rifles throughout history according to production numbers, or at least according to my best estimates of their production numbers. There's certainly room for healthy debate in terms of actual production numbers. That being said, this is a rough draft. I'm really just still trying to iron out the kinks before I really dedicate more time into this. Just working on my writing, working on my basic video editing, stuff like that. But without further ado, this is my attempt at part one. This is 10 through 6 of the top 10 most influential rifles according to production numbers. At number 10, with approximately 8 million units produced, we have the Gewehr 3 or G3 rifle. Like many of the rifles on this list which are yet to come, the G3 traces its lineage to the largest conflict in human history, the Second World War. More specifically, it is a direct descendant of the infamous Nazi Sturmgewehr project. For those who are not aware, Sturmgewehr is a German term likely coined by none other than Adolf Hitler, which literally translates to storm rifle, and is indeed the etymological progenitor of the almost universally misused modern term assault rifle. The original Sturmgewehr 44, designed by Hugo Schmeisser, was the world's first successful select-fire detachable box magazine-fed weapon to be chambered in an intermediate rifle cartridge, which does remain today the only legitimate definition of an assault rifle. As the Nazi armies starved, froze, and bled to death on the fields of Eastern Europe, the STG-44 was simplified into the STG-45M, a cheaper-to-manufacture production model. Following a time-honored tradition which goes back as far as the sharpened stick, the Nazis, their priorities cleansed by having seen into the abyss that was their impending annihilation, forsook the ornate and precise weapon manufacturing of the pre-war era to focus on purely utilitarian and economical considerations. This developmental cycle thankfully outlasted Hitler's regime through the Nazi engineer Ludwig von Grimler, who escaped prosecution during the human capital flight that followed the collapse of the Third Reich, provided he was willing to continue his work on behalf of the Allied powers. This first bore fruit in Spain, where it saw adoption as the Setmi Modelo B, and then finally returned to the Federal Republic of Germany, aka West Germany, where it earned the Gewehr 3 designation in the late 1950s. It is interesting to note that due to bureaucratic chicanery on the part of NATO and the United States government in particular, the G3 had been scaled up since the STG-45M design in order to accommodate the new full-power 7.62 by 51 millimeter standard NATO rifle cartridge. Those who were paying attention earlier will realize that this does mean that the G3, despite its Sturmgewehr pedigree, is not actually an assault rifle. It is a battle rifle, and a sledgehammer of a battle rifle at that. While often overshadowed by its contemporaries in terms of prestige, the G3 has proven to be among the world's most enduring designs, and its professional military service has outlasted many weapons which were once deemed its superiors. From the Mexican Army to European Special Operations Forces, the G3 continues to this day to proselytize the frigid lessons from the Eastern Front. We move on to number 9 on our list, the U.S. rifle caliber 30 M1, with approximately 8.2 million units produced. Colloquially known in the U.S. as the M1 Garand, the M1 was adopted by the United States Armed Forces in 1938 and went on to be the primary service weapon for the duration of U.S. involvement in the Second World War. It saw production numbers proportionate to the scale of that conflict. The M1's success cannot be written off to simple necessity, however. It is essential to understand that the M1's performance in battle was unimpeachable, and it occupies a relatively rare niche in the history of warfare as having been exactly the right weapon at exactly the right time. What sets the M1 Garand apart from every other infantry rifle of World War II was that it was a generally issued semi-automatic, and it saw service through the duration of the war. The small arms used by line infantry units of other belligerent nations were typically underwhelmingly upgraded versions of the manually operated 19th century designs with which they had fought the First World War, and a strong argument exists that these weapons were outdated even then. While the technology for mechanized war machines had leapt forward in the interwar period, the accoutrements of the riflemen were fundamentally neglected, except in America. An argument can be made perhaps that it was America's geographic isolation, non-threatened infrastructure, and relatively late entry into the war which allowed the U.S. Ordnance Department to do what no other nation could manage. Even still, however, they needed a good design, and thanks to a Quebec-born naturalized citizen, they had the best design in the world. John Garand, born Saint-Jean-le-Baptiste Cantus Garand, made certain that the U.S. Army and Marine Corps infantry were the most well-equipped and lethal fighting force on every continent they stepped out on. The M1 Garand is accurate, user-friendly, and reliable. Firing the 30-06 M2 ball cartridge, it offered all of the lethality, range, and barrier penetration of its bolt-action contemporaries. However, its gas-operated, long-stroke, piston-driven rotating bolt action gave it a much higher effective rate of fire. Increased rate of fire allowed individual soldiers to fire, miss, correct their aim, and deliver effective hits on target in less time than it took their enemies to cycle their bolt. This gave American elements the ability to gain fire superiority and initiative over a sometimes numerically superior foe. The leadership of American troops varied drastically in effectiveness, but their weapons never failed them, and for that reason the M1 Garand carries tremendous cultural and symbolic value in the U.S. It is the symbol of our greatest generation and a physical link to what many would consider to be the foundation of American international confidence. From the beaches of Salerno to Normandy to Iwo Jima and the interior battlefields of 3 continents, the M1 Garand is and always will be America's pride, a weapon which was exactly what we needed, exactly when we needed it. Moving on to number 8 on our list, with production numbers of approximately 7 to 10 million, is the Arisaka rifle of Japan. The story of the Arisaka starts in the final decade of the 19th century, a time defined by technological breakthroughs. The advent of nitrocellulose-based or smokeless gunpowder just a few years prior had absolutely shattered the prevailing understandings of what was possible for small arms. Gone were the days of slow-moving, heavy-lead projectiles, as smokeless powder made it possible to take small-diameter, lightweight jacketed projectiles and launch them at multiple times the speed of sound. The effective range of the riflemen more than tripled overnight, and the world's powers worked around the clock to bring their nation's weapon systems into the new century. Japan was not one of these powers. Rather than race the rest of the world, they demonstrated patience and took advantage of their diminutive status on the world stage, and basically just waited to decide which of the foreign powers' designs they were going to steal. The Japanese understood a fact of small arms development, which has been exploited many times throughout history, which that whenever possible, it is much more efficient to improve someone else's weapon than it is to develop your own. That's exactly what Japan did with the German 1893 Mauser design. Colonel Arisaka Nariakira took an already proven design and developed distinct simplifications, strengthening measures, and overall practical improvements. Additionally, they chambered the rifle in their indigenous 6.5 by 50 millimeter semi-rimmed cartridge, a flat-shooting, low-recoiling, and eminently practical round that I argue, like other first-generation 6.5 millimeter rounds, was way ahead of its time. Thus, the Type 30 Arisaka was adopted in the 30th year of the reign of Emperor Meiji, or 1897 for the rest of us. The Arisaka rifle first saw serious combat use in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, and it proved to be a very effective and dependable weapon in that conflict. The combination of modern equipment and an absolutely fanatical infantry corps propelled the Japanese to achieve a stunning victory over the great European power, setting in motion the Empire of Japan's meteoric rise to international prominence. In the same year that Tsar Nicholas II was forced to negotiate for peace with Japan, the Japanese adopted the next iteration of the Arisaka, the Type 38. The Type 38 was developed by General Kejiro Nambu, a career officer and son of a samurai, a man sometimes called the John Moses Browning of Japan due to the scale of his contributions to Japanese arms development. The Type 38 Arisaka proved to be an excellent weapon and saw greater production numbers than any other variant of Arisaka rifle, and saw action in the hands of both White Russian and Japanese expeditionary forces during the Russian Revolution, and then saw extensive use in the 1930s as Japan began its genocidal push for dominance of Asia and the Pacific. By the time World War II sparked off in 1939, the Type 38 was joined by the Type 99, pictured here, so named for its adoption in the 2,599th year of the Japanese calendar. The Type 99, also a Kejiro Nambu design, offered relatively minor design benefits over the Type 38. However, the most important difference was that it was chambered in the 7.7 by 58 millimeter cartridge, which the Japanese used in general-purpose machine guns, a heavier recoiling but theoretically heavier hitting round, more in line with what was being used by the European and North American forces. From their rise to prominence to the bitter end, the Japanese Empire distinguished itself as an adversary of unwavering commitment and unparalleled ferocity. They fully embodied all of the best and worst parts of a warrior culture, and they possessed so resolute a fighting spirit that in the end it could only be broken by nuclear fission. Most Arisakas bear this story in steel, as not unlike the empire they served, the emperor's chrysanthemum crest has been literally struck from existence. Our number 7 entry is unlike any other rifle on this list, as it is the only recreational firearm to be represented. I think that's a pretty remarkable thing, and I want to touch on that briefly. Every other rifle on this list was designed with the sole intention of waging war, and made this list because of its merits in that field. Whether they were truly great rifles or just good enough, the necessities of global conflict required them to be produced in sufficient numbers that they made this list. There's obviously more that can be said about precisely which factors aligned for each of the firearms to make this list, but the point is that for every rifle except for number 7, the critical factors always come back to war. So this is the civilian on our list, mighty number 7, with about 11 million units produced, the Marlin Model 60. Developed in 1959 by Nichol, what was originally called the Model 99 went into production in 1960 and remained in production until 2020. The Model 60 is a semi-automatic, tube magazine-fed rimfire rifle, chambered in the diminutive giant 22 long rifle. So what is the Marlin Model 60 and why was it so successful? Well, it wasn't the first autoloading 22 on the US civilian market, and by many standards, it certainly wasn't the best. Prior to the 1960s, most American rimfire firearms were built to more or less the same standards as their centerfire cousins, which is to say that they were made of milled steel and hardwood. At best, these made for true heirlooms, but at worst, they were expensive, heavy, surprisingly finicky, and required an engineering degree and 3 sets of hands to perform maintenance on. Thanks to its innovative use of non-traditional materials and manufacturing methods, Marlin managed with the Model 60 to bring a new type of 22 to the market, which was more affordable and user-friendly than anything which had come before it. The Model 60 was well thought out, accurate, and dependable, and took the headache and cost out of plinking and small game hunting. There's an entire generation of shooters who were raised stalking the woods and grasslands of North America with their trusty Model 60 and a pocket full of loose cartridges. The casualties, measured in birds, critters, and tin cans alike, were incalculable. Even when Sturm Ruger released their answer to the Model 60, the inarguably superior Model 1022, the bare-bones simplicity and bottom-shelf price point of the Model 60 endured, and a half-century later, there have been 2 Model 60s sold for every 1 Ruger 1022. If the M1 Garand was the symbol of the greatest generation, the mythical weapon of those Americans who faced our fiercest foes, then the Marlin Model 60 was the symbol of the peace that they won. Those young men who carried .30 caliber rifles across North Africa, Europe, and Asia came home and had young men of their own, and those baby boomers were raised to carry a much lighter firearm under much lighter circumstances. At least until Vietnam kicked off, and then things got pretty serious again. And that actually segues us pretty well back into number 6, and the dominance on this list of weapons of war. Back in the realm of combat rifles now, we take a look at number 6 on our list, the SKS, or Samozarядный Karabin Systemy Simonova, with approximately 15 million units produced. Not unlike the Gewehr 3, the SKS was a direct product of the Eastern Front of World War II. Developed by esteemed Soviet weapons designer Sergei Simonov, the SKS was a scaled-down version of the PTR-S-41 anti-tank rifle, now chambered in the new Soviet intermediate rifle cartridge, the 7.62 by 39mm M43 round. While the SKS-45 was developed with the intent of seeing service on the Eastern Front, the Soviets won the war before the SKS could be fielded in that conflict. Due to the explosion of small arms development, which immediately followed the Second World War, the SKS was made very rapidly obsolete, at least in the hands of a modern military like the Soviet Red Army. Under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, the USSR sold and gave away the technical data to manufacture SKS pattern rifles to a number of other communist nations, the most important of which turned out to be China. Unlike the Red Army of the Soviet Union, the People's Liberation Army of China was not structured to fight large-scale European-style wars, and instead subscribed to the Maoist doctrine of guerrilla warfare called the People's War. In this context, the SKS pattern, or Type 56 carbine as it was designated by the PLA, actually proved to be extremely useful, and quickly took a central role in Maoist-style conflicts for decades to come, both inside and outside of Chinese service. Perhaps the most high-profile utilization of the S-cast pattern came in the Vietnam War, where the S-cast pattern was the preferred weapon of the self-sufficient ultralight infantry units of the Viet Cong. The low capacity and low weight of feeding devices, combined with the ultra-durable semi-automatic action of the S-cast pattern, was ideal for fighters literally living off the land, well beyond the reaches of stable supply lines. While there's much room for debate regarding the ultimate pros and cons of the S-cast platform, the reality is that it proved that there's more than one way to win a war, and there are circumstances in which properly motivated men with little more than sandals, straw hats, and semi-automatic carbines can achieve strategic victory over a modern army with virtually unlimited resources. It should be noted that while the S-cast is an undeniably Russian creation and was indeed manufactured by at least 9 countries, it ultimately owes its legacy and inclusion on this list solely to the Chinese. I've researched S-cast pattern production numbers more extensively than any other weapon on this list, and my findings indicate that Chinese production accounts for approximately 73% of global production, meaning that even if we didn't include the combined production numbers of the Soviet Union, Russian Federation, Yugoslavia, Romania, Albania, East Germany, North Korea, Vietnam, and possibly Bangladesh, the Chinese Type 56 carbine alone would still be included on this list in precisely the same position. If you'd like to learn more about the Chinese Type 56 carbine, I highly recommend checking out my video, Is the Chinese S-cast Garbage? And spoiler alert, the answer is a resounding no. And that's going to be it for part 1. That was 10 through 6. Like I said, part 2 with 5 through 1 is going to be coming soon. I'd love to see guesses in the comments. If you can get 1 through 5 correct, or at least according to the numbers I'm working with, 1 through 5 correct, I will pin your comment to the top. Other than that, if you like this type of content, please like, subscribe, all that stuff. If you have suggestions, please throw them in the comments. I really do appreciate ideas. And I'm excited to try to just continue to progress as a gun tuber or whatever. So other than that, thanks so much for watching, and I really hope to catch you in the next one.